Hello everyone, this is PD 350 Motor Behavior. This lecture is on fundamental object control or manipulative skills of childhood. Previously we'd looked at locomotor skills and the developmental milestones connected with skills such as walking, running, skipping, galloping, hopping, etc. So as you recall from the last lecture, I talked about how motor behavior is broken down into subdisciplines such as motor control, motor learning, and motor development. So for these couple of lectures, we've infused the motor development content that looks at developmental milestones associated with certain motor skills. So the first skill that we look at is the one that's probably been studied the most commonly, which is the one-handed throw. There's different variations of this, such as the underarm, the sidearm, and the overarm. And there's been different approaches to looking at the stages of the throw. Some people, such as Monica Wilde, she broke the skill down into what the arms do and what the legs do. Others, such as the one we're going to look at, which was the research done by Harbenstricker, he used a total body approach to talk about what the arms and the legs are doing and not segmenting those in the analysis. So Harbenstricker's research broke the overhand throw into different stages, and you can see stage 1 on the slide here, and you can look at this and you can picture this child throwing the ball and imagine why this is considered very, very immature. It's characterized by a posterior to anterior direction with a throw front to back. The feet are remaining stationary during the throw. If there is any stepping going on, it's before the performer moves into position, so they might be taking a couple of steps and then stopping and then throwing. There's little to no trunk rotation, and any power for projection might come from just leaning the hips forward and rotating the shoulder through. This progresses to stage 2, where we see more rotation of the body around an imaginary vertical axis. The performer may step forward with either the ipsilateral or the contralateral pattern, so either the same foot or the opposite foot, and the motion may resemble a slingshot rather than a throw because of the extended arm position during the course of the throw. So you can see here, this does look like a slingshot with the arm just coming round, not really flexing and then extended, no power trunk rotation, and then no definite consistency in terms of which foot is being stepped forward in preparation for the throw. This moves on to stage 3, where we have this arm action. Note that it's still ipsilateral. In stage 3, it's the same foot with the same arm, which we obviously recognize as not being the correct way to throw. So children in stage 3 still haven't mastered that ability to step with the opposite leg to the opposite foot. And then we move on to stage 4, where now the big step here is that the movement is now contralateral. You can see on the diagram it's the opposite foot to the leg, so there's a step. However, there's still little or no rotation of the hips during the wind-up phase. Therefore, the movement of the trunk and the arm closely resembles the motions of stages 1 and 2. The stride forward with that contralateral leg provides a wide base of support and greater stability during the force production of the throw. And then finally, hopefully, our children or the people we're working with might move into stage 5. This is the most mature stage of the throw. Here you can see the wind-up phase begins with the thrown hand moving in a downward arc, and then backward as the opposite leg moves forward. The concurrent action rotates the hips and spine into position for forceful movement. As the contralateral foot strikes the surface, the hips, the spine, and the shoulder begin to rotate in sequence. So you can, and then you can see there's a follow through at the end here. So in terms of developmental milestones, you can see that boys and girls in the types of study where they've looked at the age at which 60% of boys and girls perform at each of these 5 levels, the researchers have found that boys and girls around the same age enter stage 1. So 60% of boys and girls around, I guess that's 12 months of age, might be exhibiting stage 1. And then you can see it takes a while to get to stage 2. So kids have to, for boys, they have to be around 3 years of age. That's what studies have found. Girls just a bit later. And then what's interesting about this is that boys progress pretty quickly then through stage 2, 3, 4, and eventually reaching stage 5 around 5.5 years of age. Whereas for girls, that takes a lot longer, around 8 or 9 years of age. So that's interesting, that why it takes so long for girls to reach that 5th level of throwing as opposed to the boys. And there's been a lot of research that's tried to investigate what's going on there. And is it genetics? Is it physiological? Is it sociological? Trying to explain those big differences. So there's been a lot of studies that have tried to investigate environmental and task and structural constraints that influence the development of the overarm throw. These constraints can be thought of as factors that help shape the development of the overarm throwing patterns. So in the next several slides, we're going to look at different constraints that are related to throwing, the knowledge, declarative knowledge of performers, the use of instructional cues, and we'll look at the ball size and developmental level of the throwers as we try to explain these sequences or these stages for throwing and how we can help progress learners through these different stages. A lot of the studies I'm going to reference have looked at different things. Some have looked for accuracy, some have looked for the distance of the throw, and some have measured the velocity of the throw as their dependent variables in their studies. So let me skip on to factors that influence the overarm throwing performance. The first one we're going to look at is instruction. And a basic question in a lot of studies and in the most recent studies has been whether instruction can facilitate developmental changes. Can instruction help learners move from stage 1 to 2, 3, 4, and 5? Or whether the year-to-year improvement is due to maturation and age more than instruction, which is obviously an interesting question to ask. So in terms of instruction, there's the question that we're asking, or that researchers have attempted to ask. To generalize the results before we start going and looking at specifics, researchers have found that instruction, or helping people learn how to throw, significantly affects changes in throwing technique, but not in the power or the speed of the throw, which doesn't surprise me, but let's look at the studies that have investigated that. So when we look at instruction and throwing, there's been many studies done, and I'm just going to discuss a few of these to you. One was done by Halverson and colleagues. It's an old study now, but it's still one that's discussed in the literature because it had the most control and it was the most robust. So they did an 8-week study, and in their study, let me just pull all this stuff on and then I'll explain it to you. They administered a movement program that included 120 minutes of guided practice in overarm throwing to 24 kindergarten students. So guided practice means that they were, not only did they practice the skill, but they were taught along the way. They were given instructions. A second group of 24 kindergarten students received the same movement program but no instruction. So they were just given the time to practice the skill without any instruction. So you can obviously see the big difference between those two groups being whether instruction took place or not. A third group received neither. So they were the control group, they didn't get any instruction, they didn't get to throw the ball. So following the 8-week instructional program, there were no significant changes in the ball throwing velocity. And you can see that on this slide eventually. So this was in the ball throwing velocity, and you can see that even though those bars aren't completely equal, statistically there were no significant differences between the performance of those three groups and ball throwing velocity. However, when they analyzed this further and did a follow-up study, they used the same research design, but instead of measuring ball velocity, they measured developmental changes in the movement components. An analysis of, let me pull this up and then I'll explain it to you. So they were looking at the qualitative components or the technique of doing the throw rather than how hard the participants threw the ball. And again, they're looking at whether there was a difference between the groups on whether instruction took place or not. So what you can see here is that they found that instruction significantly affected changes in the throwing technique, but not the velocity. So from this, they recommended that any studies that look at the overhand throw should use the technique or the analysis of the qualitative components of the throw as a dependent variable rather than just looking at ball velocity. They also stated from their studies that instruction was an important component when looking at the development of throwing technique, which I think we would all hope is true, because this supports the concept of why we need to teach children how to perform skills correctly. They don't just evolve, they don't just happen. Children have to be taught how to perform these skills to move from stages to the next stage. Another factor that's been examined is the concept of declarative knowledge, which is loosely defined as whether learners can verbally state how to perform a skill. Not so much be able to actually do the skill, but do they have the knowledge on how to do the skill. So declarative knowledge appears to be an important factor affecting the throwing performance of young children. And we'll look at a couple of studies that have led to that kind of statement. Let me pull this one up and I'll walk you through it. So in one study, researchers used the test of gross motor development to identify 25 what they considered talented throwers and 25 awkward throwers. So they kind of pre-tested using the TGMD, and from the pre-test they separated their participants into these two groups of talented versus awkward throwers. And then they used a verbally administered questionnaire. They examined the knowledge of the one-handed overarm throw between these two groups. The research and the results indicated that the awkward throwers possessed significantly less declarative knowledge than did the talented throwers. And when they analyzed each question, they found that there were significant differences existing between questions related to the ball size, which foot to step with, what trajectory to throw at, and the ability to recognize correct form in general. So what they found here was that, in a nutshell, people who are at the more mature stages of throwing have a better knowledge of the throw, which doesn't really surprise us, but it leads us to recognize that we need to be teaching children the knowledge and what's going on, as well as the physical skill of being able to perform it. Another factor that's been studied related to the overarm throw is the use of instructional cues. And this is similar to instruction, but just a little bit different in that it's looking at specifically over instructional cues. So instructional cues, you can think of these as those very short, often 1, 2, 3 word cues that focus performers on certain parts of the skill. So lots of studies done here, and basically they found that the identification of the critical cues in skills helps throwing performance. And let me walk you through one of the studies that has led to that kind of generalization. One study performed by Fronsky examined the use of multiple cues on the throwing performance of 3rd through 5th grade students. So in their study, the independent variable which they were in control of was where the students received cues, and some did and some didn't. And then the dependent variables in their study, what they were measuring, looked at the process or the performance of the throw and also the product. So students had to throw 318 balls over 5 instructional days in this study. The verbal cues emphasized to the groups that received verbal cues were take a big step towards the target with your opposite foot of your throwing arm, take your arm straight down, then stretch all the way back, and release the ball when you see your fingers. A control group received an equal number of throws but no verbal cues. The researchers concluded that the group receiving the verbal cues shows significant improvement in both process, arm action, foot action, and product, distance variables. The foot action component reflected the greatest improvement, which in turn resulted in an improved throwing distance. So they found that breaking the skill down into these cues and providing the cues to the subjects led to greater technique and greater distance, which again is more support for the argument of teaching skills and breaking skills down into cues, presenting those cues to children and giving them feedback and helping to teach them to move from stage to stage. So this just shows what I discussed, that the group receiving the verbal cues improved or performed better on a post-test more than the group that didn't receive the cues. So they concluded that teaching skill techniques using proper cues should be impressed upon pre-surface teachers as well as experienced practitioners. So that's obviously directly related to teaching, and those of you who are going to go into teaching and coaching fields. But I think you can also take information from that if you're going to be a therapist, a physical therapist, or working with athletes. In that, if you're teaching motor skills, it's important that you break those skills down into critical cues and present those cues to your learners. So from their research, they actually suggested that knowing that we need to use cues, that it leads to greater improvements in process and product. They broke down the overhand throw and modified a lot of the existing cues into 3 critical cues, and those are the ones listed on the slide. So perhaps if you're teaching children how to throw overhand, you could use these 3 cues, as these researchers suggest that it leads to the most learning. Another factor that's been found to influence overhand throw performance is ball size, and these have also been found obviously to affect catching ability. So not so much research done on the effect of ball size as other areas such as instructional cues and knowledge. However, I think we need to take a quick look at this. Obviously, the research, as you might suspect, suggests that when the ball size is scaled up, it reaches a point, or a tipping point, where the performer resorts to a less mature pattern. So we know that research has shown us that as the diameter of the ball increases, there's a transition from throwing one hand to two-handed grasping. So what? So what the researchers suggest is that we need to use a concept called body scaling, which is the idea of scaling equipment that is sized appropriately for the performer's body's dimensions. So when we're working with learners, we need to be aware that we need to use the appropriate size equipment for their body size. Some of the more interesting research connected to the overarm throw has looked at gender differences. And anyone who works regularly with young children will tell you that there's a vast difference between the overarm throwing abilities of young boys and young girls. And there's been lots of research done on this. One meta-analysis, which combines lots of different studies into one analysis, found that the greatest gender differences among the skills examined, and they looked at lots of different skills, was throwing. And this looked at over 20 motor performance studies done over the last 20 to 30 years. So this led researchers to develop a series of studies designed to uncover why such gender differences exist. And they've speculated that such differences could be accounted for by things such as heredity, physiological differences, and something that's gained a lot of traction in the last several years as socio-cultural factors. So we're not going to go into this in too much depth, but it might be something that you become interested in. Why are there gender differences in the performance of the overarm throw, and what's causing that? What researchers have stated is that the best predictors of throwing development in girls appears to be participation in sports and the presence of an older brother in the household. So when those variables have been present, it's often resulted in or some kind of relationship between those things being present and girls showing more mature throwing patterns. I wonder if that relates to you. Did you participate in sports if you're a female when you were younger, and did you have an older brother in your house? If you did, the studies have found that to be related to greater chances of more mature throwing in younger girls. For boys, the best predictors of throwing development has been a father's sport involvement and father-son skill play. So if those two things were present for you, perhaps you had a greater likelihood of showing more mature throwing patterns. Looking at catching, not as much research done on catching as the overhand throw. Catching is defined as the bringing of an airborne object under control by using the hands and the arms. A weakness here there's been no longitudinal studies that have tracked children over time. For two-handed catching, the developmental sequences and milestones tell us that the first attempts as infants at catching is just stopping at a rolling object by sitting on the floor with the legs apart. First of all, the legs kind of trap the ball, and then that progresses to the hands trapping the ball. And the first attempts at airborne object catching is pretty passive. When the ball's thrown at a child, they outstretch their arms, and they use the outstretched arms to kind of trap it against the body. We know that as children get older, catching is something where there's quite a variability of performance on. We know that children in general can be quite afraid of catching, and that affects a lot of the studies that have been conducted on this. Some of the researchers have suggested that these are learned responses from earlier failings when kids were not able to catch and the balls hit them, and so they've learned that could be a dangerous activity. So some developmental sequences and milestones for catching. So here on the first one you can see that in stage 1 the child's hands are directly in front of him, the elbows are extended, the palms are facing upwards or inwards towards the mid-sagittal plane, When the ball contacts the hands or arms, the elbows are flexed in an attempt to secure the ball by holding it against the chest. So kind of trapping it against the chest. This progresses to stage 2. In stage 2, the child prepares to receive the object with the arms in front of the body. The elbows are extended or slightly flexed. When they see the ball, the arms begin kind of a motion that culminates by securing the ball against the chest. It differs from stage 1 in that the receiver initiates the arm action prior to the ball-arm contact. Stage 3, researchers have broken down into a couple of stages. In stage 1, the child is using the chest as a first contact point. In stage 2, the child attempts to catch the ball with the hands. Moves on to stage 4, where the child prepares to receive the ball by flexing the elbows and presenting the arms ahead of the frontal plane. So they're kind of in that prepared stage, and the ball is caught with the hands alone. So obviously that's a big step from stage 3 to stage 4. And then stage 5, we can see that the child is now ready to change his or her stationary base in order to receive the ball. So they're stepping in the direction of the catch. And you can see here that they can raise their hands up into the direction or take a step in the direction of the throw. Similar developmental milestones for boys and girls in terms of the two-handed catch, and you can see that on the bottom of this slide, with girls maybe starting on average a few months earlier, beginning to exhibit stage 1, and then moving through the different stages and then getting to stage 5 a little bit earlier than boys, which is interesting because that is in contrast to the milestones for the throw. And perhaps you can think to yourself, what might be causing that? What is it that makes the boys exhibit more mature patterns of the throw earlier, whereas girls do better at catching? So there's little scientific evidence and research that's been done regarding the ability to catch with one hand. So we previously looked at two-handed catch. The few studies that are out there tell us that boys typically outperform girls at all ages. The ball location is a factor, whether it's coming from high or low, and that one-handed catching is less successful than two-handed catching. So the kind of research that really doesn't surprise you, and I'm not sure how much that is useful to us. There's been numerous factors that have been identified as affecting catching ability. So these are factors that may influence the catching development. It's been difficult to compare and contrast these studies because they vary as to the major constraints studied, such as the type of the ball, the speed of the throw, the distance of the projection. So that's made it kind of hard to compare studies to each other. Nevertheless, I think an awareness of these findings can help us design future studies and lend some insight into teaching strategies for teaching this skill. So we'll look at a few of these. The effects of ball size on an individual's catching ability has probably received the most attention, with initial studies consistently concluding that larger balls improve young children's catching performance. These conclusions were based on the premise that young children are far-sighted and therefore would profit from using the larger ball, which they would find easier to track. However, most early studies evaluated the child's catching attempts on a pass-fail basis. So either yes or no, they call it. Human error was unfortunately a major consideration when we used that pass-fail basis, because balls were often simply just tossed to the subject by the experimenter, allowing for considerable variability in the tosses. Since then, researchers have tried to control that factor by mechanically projecting balls to the participants in their studies, so they could be consistent in the throws that were being received. There's been inconsistencies on the research in this area. For example, other studies have found that small balls are more conducive to successful catching. So I said earlier on that large balls might be better. Other studies have found that perhaps the smaller balls are more conducive to helping children progress through the stages. So clearly we need more information on this topic. Should we use larger balls, smaller balls, and should we place a premium on early acquisition of the technique or early success? If we want early success, then maybe we go with the larger balls, but if we're more interested in technique evolving over time, maybe we use a smaller size ball. Interestingly, researchers have manipulated both the ball color and the background color to see how it improves catching performance. In one study, researchers found that blue and yellow balls were caught significantly better than white balls, and that children attained the highest catching scores when blue balls were projected against a white background. So I don't know if that's information you could use or not, but there has been differences found between the color of the balls used and the background that was in the background when they were trying to catch, the background color. Also, when children were allowed to pick the color of the balls that they were catching, that led to greater success. So probably something to do with interest levels, arousal, and motivation going on right there. For ball velocity, as you might expect, balls thrown harder were harder to catch in these studies. Researchers found that catching performance decreased as the ball velocity increased. And in that specific study, they looked at 7 and 9-year-old children, and that they compared children catching balls thrown at 25 feet per second to 33 feet per second, and found that the slower velocity led to greater catching results. There are a couple more slides left. One study looked at vision and viewing time, and found that as the viewing time decreased, so did the proficiency in retaining the projectile. This led to some researchers suggesting that we should use balls that move more slowly through the space, such as beach balls, wiffle balls, and sponge balls. And that's the type of research that's been done that have led to practitioners that are helping children improve their catching skills, modify the equipment to use equipment that moves slower and that the children can see for a longer period of time. And then last slide, finally, one study, and this was only one study, so I'm not sure how much credence we can put in this, but I think it's interesting because it does show you a single subject design. So one study examined the influence of catching instruction on children's one-handed catching ability. Using a single subject design, these researchers trained an 8-year-old boy. So there was only one subject in this study. Training consisted of 4 assessment sessions and 3 instruction plus practice sessions administered alternately on 7 successive days. Each instruction and practice session lasted 30 minutes. Following the 3rd instruction and practice session, significant changes were observed in both percentage of successful catches and level of maturity or the technique used to catch the ball. These researchers noted that by the end of the study, the 8-year-old boy's catching ability had progressed from that of a typical 8-year-old to that of subjects who were 2 years older. So they made the point that lots of instruction, lots of assessment helped this subject greatly improve his catching ability, as you might suspect. But similar to the throw, it led support into to the concept of providing good instruction to help people with these motor skills. So that's the end of this lecture. We looked at the development of a couple of manipulative or object control skills, the different stages that children go through, and the developmental milestones that have been found through research.